Dance of Defiance. Washington, D.C., 1920. Margaret O'Connor discovered a mysterious inscription carved into an ancient monument. His sacrifice endures, followed by the name Lieutenant Victor Mason, echoing in silence. Chapter 1. The Whispers of Stone. The crisp autumn air nipped at Margaret O'Connor's cheeks, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant rumble of the city. Washington, D.C., 1920. 2 years after the guns had fallen silent, the world was still piecing itself back together, brick by brick, memory by memory. Margaret, however, felt more shattered than ever. The war had taken her brother, Thomas, leaving a void in her life that no amount of time seemed capable of filling. She clutched the worn leather-bound journal closer, its familiar weight a small comfort in the vastness of the tidal basin. She'd come to the newly dedicated monument, a sprawling expanse of white marble reflecting the pale afternoon sun, seeking solace, perhaps, or a connection to the countless others who mourned. It was a place for remembrance, a place for healing, or so the newspapers proclaimed. But Margaret found only a cold, echoing emptiness. The sheer scale of the monument, meant to honor the fallen, felt overwhelming, impersonal. She traced the names etched into the stone, each one representing a life cut short, a story untold. Her fingers brushed against the smooth, cold surface, a stark contrast to the burning grief that consumed her. She paused, drawn to an anomaly, a small, almost hidden inscription carved into the base of one of the pillars, tucked away from the grand pronouncements of heroism and sacrifice. It was almost as if it was meant to be overlooked, a secret whispered only to those who knew where to look. Squinting, Margaret leaned closer, the fading light making it difficult to read. Dusting away a layer of grime with the edge of her glove, she deciphered the words, etched with a delicate, almost hesitant hand. His sacrifice endures, followed, on a separate line, by a name, Lieutenant Victor Mason. The words sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't the grand, sweeping statement of patriotism found elsewhere on the monument. It was personal, intimate, a private grief laid bare in the public square. Who was Lieutenant Victor Mason? And whose hand had carved this hidden tribute? The official inscription spoke of duty and honor, but this spoke of something deeper, something raw and unresolved. Margaret pulled out her journal and a stub of charcoal, carefully copying the inscription. The act itself felt like a transgression, a violation of a sacred secret. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something significant, something that demanded to be understood. The name Victor Mason was unfamiliar. He wasn't listed among the prominent figures commemorated on the main panels of the monument. He was a ghost, a whisper in the stone. The wind picked up, swirling fallen leaves around her feet. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the tidal basin. The monument, bathed in the fading light, seemed to take on a life of its own, its white marble glowing with an ethereal luminescence. Margaret felt a sudden, inexplicable connection to this unknown lieutenant, to the person who had loved him enough to leave this hidden mark. She looked around, half expecting to see someone watching her, the author of the inscription perhaps. But the plaza was deserted, save for a lone groundskeeper raking leaves in the distance. The city, with its bustling streets and vibrant energy, felt a million miles away. Here, in the shadow of the monument, time seemed to stand still. Margaret closed her journal, the inscription now safely recorded within its pages. The weight of her own grief, the loss of her brother, felt momentarily lessened, replaced by a strange sense of purpose. She would find out who Lieutenant Victor Mason was. She would uncover the story behind the cryptic inscription. She owed it to him, to the unknown mourner, and perhaps to herself. It was a way, she realized, to keep the memory of her own brother alive, to honor the sacrifices that had been made, both known and unknown. As she turned to leave, a single, crimson maple leaf landed on the inscription, a splash of vibrant color against the cold, white stone. It was as if the monument itself was acknowledging her promise, a silent blessing on her quest. The breeze seemed to whisper a name, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur carried on the wind. Victor. It was a sound that felt both mournful and strangely hopeful. The fading light made it seem as though the leaf began to pulse, ever so slightly. Was it the light? Or something else? Chapter 2. Echoes of a Lost War. The Library of Congress, a majestic temple of knowledge, loomed before Margaret. Its grand halls and towering shelves held the accumulated wisdom of centuries, yet she sought answers to a question barely whispered in the present. The inscription, "His sacrifice endures," and the name Lieutenant Victor Mason, haunted her waking thoughts and invaded her dreams. She had spent the past week poring over casualty lists, regimental histories, and newspaper archives, finding no trace of the mysterious lieutenant. The air inside the library was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, a comforting aroma that usually soothed Margaret's soul. Today, however, it felt oppressive, a suffocating weight of unanswered questions. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble floors. The hushed whispers of other researchers, the rustling of pages, the occasional cough all seemed to amplify the silence surrounding Victor Mason's story. She found a quiet corner in the reading room, a secluded alcove overlooking the city. The view, usually a source of inspiration, offered little solace today. The bustling streets below seemed a world apart from the quiet desperation that gripped her. She spread out her notes, the inscription copied meticulously onto several pages, along with a growing list of dead ends and frustrating omissions. The official records were frustratingly incomplete. The war had been a chaotic, sprawling conflict, and the sheer number of casualties had overwhelmed the record-keeping systems. Many soldiers, especially those who had died in the early years of the war, were simply listed as missing, presumed dead. Others were victims of misidentification, their names lost or distorted in the fog of war. Margaret had started to feel a sense of despair, a creeping feeling that Victor Mason might forever remain a ghost, a name etched in stone with no story to tell. She rubbed her tired eyes, the long hours of research taking their toll. The lamplight cast long shadows across her notes, making the words seem to dance and blur. Suddenly, a memory surfaced, a fleeting image from her childhood. Her father, a history professor at Georgetown University, had once told her about the unofficial histories of war, the stories that never made it into the official records. These were the tales of individual heroism, of quiet acts of courage, of the human cost of conflict that often went unacknowledged. The real stories, he had said, are often found in the margins, in the letters and diaries of the soldiers themselves, in the memories of those who loved them. Inspired by this recollection, Margaret decided to shift her focus. She abandoned the official records and turned her attention to the library's vast collection of personal papers, the letters, diaries, and memoirs of soldiers who had served in the Great War. It was a daunting task, like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. But she was determined to persevere. Hours passed, and Margaret lost herself in the intimate accounts of life on the front lines. She read of unimaginable horrors, of the constant fear of death, of the mud and the blood and the endless waiting. She also read of moments of camaraderie, of unexpected kindness, of the enduring power of the human spirit. As she read, she began to piece together a picture of the war that was far more complex and nuanced than the sanitized version presented in the official histories. She learned about the psychological toll of the conflict, the shell shock that left many veterans traumatized and unable to return to normal life. She read about the nurses who risked their lives to care for the wounded, often working in appalling conditions with limited resources. And then, in a battered, leather-bound diary belonging to a Sergeant Elijah Clark, she found a mention of a Lieutenant Mason. It was a brief entry, dated July 1918, just months before the armistice. Lieutenant Mason pulled young Private Thompson from the wreckage of the trench after the shelling. Brave fellow, Mason. Didn't hesitate for a second. Said he had a sister back home. Wouldn't want her to lose her brother. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Could this be him? Could this be the Lieutenant Victor Mason whose sacrifice endured? The entry didn't provide a first name, but the context, The description of his bravery resonated with the sentiment of the inscription. It was a small clue, but it was the first tangible evidence she had found that Victor Mason had actually existed, that he had been more than just a name etched in stone. A renewed flicker of purpose ignited within her. It felt like a tiny spark, but in this dimly lit corner, it felt as bright as the sun. She was sure, though she dared not voice it, that it was her Victor. But what was next? Chapter 3. The Archivist's Secret. The discovery of Sergeant Clark's diary entry, however brief, had breathed new life into Margaret's quest. The Lieutenant Mason mentioned, the one who'd risked his life to save a young private, felt intrinsically linked to the inscription. Now, she needed to confirm his identity and delve deeper into his story. She returned to the Library of Congress the next day, her steps lighter, a renewed sense of purpose driving her forward. She sought out the archivist in charge of the personal papers collection, a Mr. Silas Blackwood, a man known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the library's holdings and his somewhat eccentric personality. He was a thin, wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow and a pair of spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. He looked as though he'd been born and raised amongst the dusty shelves, a living embodiment of the library itself. Margaret found him in his office, a cramped, chaotic space overflowing with books, documents, and artifacts. He was hunched over a magnifying glass, examining a faded photograph with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He barely acknowledged her presence, merely grunting in response to her greeting. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret began, her voice hesitant, "I'm researching a Lieutenant Mason who served in the Great War. I found a mention of him in Sergeant Elijah Clark's diary, but I'm having trouble finding any further information." Blackwood finally looked up, his eyes, magnified by the thick lenses of his spectacles, seeming to pierce through her. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Mason, you say?" He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "There were dozens of Masons who served. You'll need to be more specific." Margaret explained about the inscription, about the sacrifice indoors phrase, and the date of the diary entry. She described the lieutenant's act of bravery, his concern for the private's sister. She poured out her week of searching, her voice cracking with a mixture of frustration and hope. Blackwood listened patiently, his gaze fixed on her. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, tapping a long, bony finger against the photograph he'd been examining. "There's a file," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A restricted file, pertaining to a Lieutenant Victor Mason. But it's not available to the public." Margaret's heart leaped. A restricted file. That explained why she hadn't been able to find any information in the official records. But why was it restricted? What secret did it contain? "Why is it restricted?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Blackwood hesitated, glancing around his cluttered office as if checking for eavesdroppers. "It's complicated," he said. "The file contains sensitive information, details about a court-martial." A court-martial? Margaret's mind reeled. This was unexpected, a twist she hadn't anticipated. The brave lieutenant, the man who had risked his life to save another, had been court-martialed? What had he done? "Can I see it?" she asked, her voice pleading. Blackwood shook his head. "I'm not authorized to release it. It requires special permission from the Mason family." The Mason family. So, there were relatives, survivors. This was a new lead, a potential pathway to unlocking the mystery. But it also presented a new challenge. How would she find them? And would they be willing to share the secrets contained in the restricted file? Do you know how I could contact them?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Blackwood looked at her, a flicker of something akin to sympathy in his eyes. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, worn address book. He flipped through the pages, his finger tracing the faded entries. "There was a sister," he said, his voice low. "A Miss Eleanor Mason. She used to correspond with the library, requesting information about her brother. But that was years ago. I haven't heard from her in a long time." He copied an address onto a slip of paper and handed it to her. It was an address in Georgetown, not far from where Margaret lived. "This is all I can do," he said, his voice firm. The rest is up to you. Margaret thanked him, clutching the slip of paper as if it were a lifeline. She left the library, her mind racing. The court-martial added a new layer of complexity to the story, but it also made her more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The address was a tangible link to Victor Mason's past, a potential doorway to understanding his sacrifice. The cool air outside seemed to sharpen her senses. A single question echoed in her mind. What had happened to Lieutenant Victor Mason? And, even more urgently, would his sister be willing to tell her? Chapter 4. Letters from the Front. The Georgetown address was a stately, if somewhat faded, Victorian townhouse on a quiet, tree-lined street. The paint was peeling in places, and the garden was overgrown, but it still retained an air of faded grandeur, a silent testament to a bygone era. Margaret stood on the doorstep, her heart pounding in her chest. The slip of paper with the address, now creased and slightly damp from her nervous grip, felt like a fragile bridge connecting her to the past. She hesitated, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She had rehearsed what she would say, how she would explain her quest, her connection to the cryptic inscription. But now, standing before the door, all her carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. What if Eleanor Mason wasn't there? What if she refused to speak to her? Summoning her courage, Margaret reached out and pressed the doorbell. The sound echoed through the silent house, a mournful chime that seemed to hang in the air. She waited, listening for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the slow, deliberate shuffle of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and a cloud of white hair. She was frail, her skin almost translucent, but her gaze was sharp and intelligent. This was Eleanor Mason, Victor's sister. Margaret could see a faint resemblance, a shared intensity in their eyes. "Miss Mason?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Margaret O'Connor. I'm researching your brother, Lieutenant Victor Mason." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of suspicion crossing her face. "Victor?" she said, her voice raspy with age. "What is it you want to know?" Margaret explained about the inscription on the monument, about her discovery of the diary entry, about the restricted file at the Library of Congress. She spoke quickly, urgently, afraid that Eleanor might close the door on her at any moment. Eleanor listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Margaret finished, she remained silent for a long moment, studying her with those piercing blue eyes. "Come in, child," she finally said, stepping aside to allow Margaret to enter. "We have much to discuss." The interior of the house was dim and cluttered, filled with antique furniture, faded photographs, and the lingering scent of lavender and old books. It felt like stepping back in time, a world untouched by the modern era. Eleanor led Margaret to a small parlor, a cozy room dominated by a large fireplace and a worn, overstuffed sofa. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to the sofa. "I'll make some tea." As Eleanor busied herself with the tea things, Margaret looked around the room, her eyes drawn to a collection of photographs on the mantelpiece. There were several pictures of a young man in uniform, a handsome, smiling soldier with the same piercing blue eyes as a sister. This was Victor, Margaret realized, the man whose sacrifice endured. Eleanor returned with a tray bearing a delicate porcelain teapot and 2 cups. She poured the tea, the fragrant steam filling the room. "I have his letters," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "Letters he sent me from the front. They're all I have left of him." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. Letters. These were exactly what she had been hoping for, a direct window into Victor's thoughts and experiences. Eleanor rose and went to a small, antique writing desk. She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded in places, but the words were still legible. "He wrote to me almost every week," Eleanor said, her voice choked with emotion. "He told me about the war, about the horrors he witnessed, but he always tried to reassure me, to tell me that he was all right." She handed the letters to Margaret, her hands trembling. "Read them," she said. "Read them, and you'll understand." Margaret carefully untied the ribbon and began to read. The letters were a window into a lost world, a world of mud and blood, of fear and courage, of longing and loss. Victor wrote about the daily grind of trench warfare, the constant shelling, the ever-present threat of death. He described the camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers, the small acts of kindness that helped them endure the unimaginable. He also wrote about his dreams for the future, about his hopes for a life after the war. He spoke of his love for Eleanor, his only family, and his determination to return home to her. As she continued reading through the chronologically stacked letters, a growing sense of unease settled in her stomach. The last letter was dated a week before the court-martial. There was no mention of trouble. No mention of anything but hope. The stark difference between the hopeful words and Blackwood's revelation created an unsettling chasm that Margaret knew she had to cross. What had occurred in that missing week? Chapter 5. A Shadow in Arlington. The letters, filled with Victor's vibrant spirit and unwavering hope, painted a stark contrast to the ominous shadow of the court-martial. Margaret spent days immersed in his words, tracing his journey from eager volunteer to seasoned soldier, his optimism slowly eroding under the relentless weight of war. The final letter, with its poignant expressions of love for Eleanor and dreams of a peaceful future, left a gaping hole in the narrative. What had transpired in the week leading up to his court-martial? Eleanor, though frail, proved to be a wellspring of memories. She shared anecdotes about Victor's childhood, his mischievous nature, his unwavering loyalty, his deep-seated sense of justice. She spoke of his passion for poetry, his love of nature, his quiet determination to make a difference in the world. These stories, interwoven with the poignant details from his letters, brought Victor to life, transforming him from a name on a stone to a complex, multifaceted individual. However, when Margaret cautiously broached the subject of the court-martial, Eleanor's demeanor changed. Her eyes clouded over, her voice became strained, and a deep sadness settled over her features. "It's a painful subject," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. I never fully understood what happened." The official explanation was unsatisfactory. They claimed he disobeyed a direct order, but that didn't sound like Victor. He was brave, yes, but he was also disciplined. He respected authority. She hesitated, her gaze drifting towards the window, her eyes unfocused, lost in the mists of the past. "There were rumors," she continued, her voice barely audible, whispers of something else, something darker. "But I couldn't bear to believe them. I preferred to remember him as he was, the brother I loved, the hero who saved that young private." Margaret sensed Eleanor's reluctance to delve deeper into the painful memories. She didn't want to push her, to cause her further distress. But she also knew that the truth, however painful, was essential to understanding Victor's sacrifice. Following a hunch and a cryptic remark Eleanor had made about Victor's frequent visits to Arlington National Cemetery before his deployment, Margaret decided to visit the cemetery herself. Perhaps, she thought, she might find some clue, some connection to Victor's past among the silent rows of white headstones. Arlington was a vast, solemn expanse, a city of the dead stretching as far as the eye could see. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, a stark reminder of the human cost of war. Margaret wandered among the graves, reading the names and dates, each one representing a life cut short, a story untold. The air was crisp and cold, the sky a pale, washed-out blue. The wind whispered through the bare branches of the trees, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the grief of generations. Margaret felt a profound sense of sadness, a weight of loss that pressed down on her. She searched for Victor's name, knowing that he wasn't buried there. He was officially listed as missing, presumed dead, his body never recovered. But she felt drawn to the place, as if his spirit might somehow linger among the fallen. As she walked, she noticed a small, secluded section of the cemetery, tucked away from the main avenues. It was an older section, the headstones weathered and worn, some of them almost illegible. She felt a strange pull towards this area, an inexplicable sense of familiarity. And then she saw it. A small, unassuming headstone, partially hidden by an overgrown shrub. It wasn't Victor's, but the name on it struck a chord. Private Thomas J. Thompson. It read, the same name as the young soldier Victor had saved, according to Sergeant Clark's diary. Margaret knelt down, brushing away the dead leaves and dirt that obscured the inscription. Beneath the name, she found a small, hand-carved inscription, similar to the one on the monument, saved by an angel. Forever grateful. A wave of emotion washed over Margaret. This was a connection, a tangible link between Victor and the young man whose life he had saved. It confirmed the story in Clark's diary, reinforced the image of Victor as a selfless, courageous individual. But it also raised more questions. Why had Victor been so drawn to Arlington? Was there a connection between his visits and his subsequent court-martial? A small detail caught the edge of her eye, barely visible. A tiny, almost microscopic carving just beneath the hand-carved message. It was a single initial, V. The style matched that on the monument. But how?
And why?
Chapter 6. The Mason Family Legacy. The discovery of Private Thompson's headstone, with its poignant inscription and the subtly carved V, deepened the mystery surrounding Victor Mason. The confirmation of his act of bravery only intensified the questions surrounding his court-martial. Why would a man who risked his life to save another be accused of disobeying orders? What was the darker truth that Eleanor had alluded to? Margaret returned to Eleanor's house, her mind buzzing with new questions. She found the elderly woman sitting by the fireplace, gazing into the flames, lost in thought. I found Private Thompson's grave, Margaret said softly, showing Eleanor the photograph she had taken of the inscription. Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. He came to visit me, she said, her voice trembling. After the war. He told me about Victor, about how he saved his life. He said he owed him everything. She paused, her gaze drifting back to the fireplace. He also said that Victor had been troubled, that he had been investigating something dangerous. Margaret's heart quickened. This was the first concrete indication that Victor's court-martial might have been connected to something more than a simple act of disobedience. What was he investigating? Margaret asked, her voice urgent. Eleanor shook her head. I don't know.
He wouldn't tell me.
He said it was too dangerous.
He said he was protecting me.
She reached into a small wooden box on the mantelpiece and pulled out a faded photograph. It was a picture of Victor, standing beside a stern-looking older man in a military uniform. This is our father, Eleanor said. General Alistair Mason. He was a decorated officer, a hero of the Spanish-American War. He had high expectations for Victor. Margaret examined the photograph. General Mason's face was hard, unyielding, his eyes cold and distant. He exuded an aura of authority and power, a stark contrast to the warmth and compassion she had seen in Victor's letters. Did they get along? Margaret asked cautiously. Eleanor sighed. They had a complicated relationship. Father was a strict disciplinarian. He believed in duty, honor, obedience above all else. Victor was more of a free spirit. He questioned things. He challenged authority. She paused, her gaze fixed on the photograph. I think Father resented Victor's independence. He wanted him to follow in his footsteps, to become a career military officer. But Victor had other plans. He wanted to be a poet, a writer. This revelation shed new light on Victor's character. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a poet, a dreamer, a man with a passion for words and a yearning for a life beyond the battlefield. This made his decision to enlist even more intriguing. Why had he chosen to follow a path that seemed so contrary to his true nature? Did your father know about the court-martial? Margaret asked. Eleanor nodded. He was furious. He refused to believe that Victor had been disobedient. He pulled strings, used his influence to suppress the truth. He wanted to protect the family name, the Mason legacy. So, the restricted file, the sensitive information it contained, was likely the result of General Mason's interference. He had used his power to bury the truth, to protect his own reputation, even at the expense of his son's. There's something else, Eleanor said, her voice hesitant. A letter. From father to Victor. It arrived after Victor was reported missing. I've never shown it to anyone. She retrieved a single, unopened letter from the wooden box. The envelope was addressed to Lieutenant Victor Mason, in General Mason's distinctive handwriting. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the seal unbroken. This was the next key. It had to be. A chilling thought. What if she was not meant to open it? What if Eleanor was not meant to have kept it? Chapter 7. Beneath the Cherry Blossoms. The unopened letter from General Mason to Victor felt heavy with unspoken secrets. Margaret and Eleanor sat in silence, the weight of the past pressing down on them. The crackling fire in the hearth was the only sound, a counterpoint to the silent tension that filled the room. Eleanor held the letter, her hands trembling, her gaze fixed on the faded ink of her brother's name. I've been afraid to open it, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Afraid of what it might reveal. Afraid of shattering the image I have of Victor, of our father. Margaret understood her fear. The letter represented a potential turning point, a moment of truth that could either illuminate or destroy. But she also knew that they couldn't ignore it. It was a vital piece of the puzzle, a direct link to the events leading up to Victor's court-martial. We need to know, Eleanor, Margaret said gently. We need to know the truth, whatever it may be. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of trepidation and resolve. She carefully broke the seal, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the brittle paper. The letter was short, concise, written in General Mason's characteristic, commanding tone. Victor, your actions have brought shame upon this family. Your reckless disregard for orders, your insubordination, is inexcusable. I have done everything in my power to mitigate the damage, to protect you from the consequences of your folly. But I cannot condone your behavior. There are matters of which you are unaware, secrets that must be protected at all costs. Your investigation, your meddling in affairs that do not concern you, has put everything at risk. You must cease and desist immediately. Return to your unit, obey your commanding officer, and redeem yourself in the eyes of your country and your family. Do not contact me again until you have done so. Father. The letter confirmed Eleanor's suspicions. Victor had been investigating something that his father considered dangerous and threatening. The reckless disregard for orders was likely a cover story, a way to conceal the true nature of Victor's actions. The secrets that must be protected hinted at a conspiracy, a hidden truth that General Mason was desperate to keep buried. What secrets? Margaret wondered aloud, her mind racing. What was Victor investigating? Eleanor shook her head, her eyes filled with confusion and despair. I don't know. He never told me. But I knew he was involved in something dangerous. He had changed. He was haunted. Margaret remembered the cryptic remark Eleanor had made earlier about Victor's frequent visits to Arlington National Cemetery. Was there a connection? Could the secrets be buried there, among the silent rows of headstones? We need to go back to Arlington, Margaret said, her voice filled with a sudden urgency. There's something there, something we're missing. Eleanor agreed, a flicker of determination in her eyes. They decided to go the next day, in the early morning before the crowds arrived. The following morning, a light mist hung over the tidal basin, the cherry blossoms, in full bloom, a delicate pink against the gray sky. The air was still and quiet, the city just beginning to stir. Margaret and Eleanor walked hand in hand towards the monument, the scene of Margaret's initial discovery. As they approached the pillar with the cryptic inscription, Margaret felt a surge of anticipation. She knelt down, tracing the words with her finger, "His sacrifice endures." She examined the stone around the inscription, searching for any clue, any detail she might have missed before. And then she saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible crack in the stone, running just below the inscription. It was so subtle that she had overlooked it before, but now, in the soft morning light, it was clearly visible. She carefully inserted the tip of her penknife into the crack, gently prying it open. A small, hollow space was revealed, hidden within the stone, and inside, nestled among the dust and debris, was a small, tightly rolled piece of paper. It was so small it would be easily overlooked, even intentionally discarded, by anyone who didn't know what to search for. What now? Chapter 8. The Code of Silence. The small, rolled piece of paper hidden within the monument's cracked stone felt like the key to unlocking the entire mystery. Margaret carefully extracted it, her hands trembling with anticipation. Eleanor stood beside her, her breath held captive in her chest, her eyes fixed on the fragile document. The mist swirled around them, creating an ethereal atmosphere, as if the spirits of the fallen were watching, waiting for the truth to be revealed. Unfurling the paper with utmost care, Margaret revealed a series of what appeared to be random letters and numbers. It was a code, a cipher designed to conceal a hidden message. Victor, it seemed, had not only been investigating a secret, but he had also taken steps to protect his findings, leaving this coded message as a final testament, a breadcrumb trail for someone to follow. "Do you recognize it?" Margaret asked Eleanor, her voice hushed. Eleanor shook her head.
No.
Victor never mentioned anything about codes or ciphers. But he was always interested in puzzles in secret languages. He used to create them with his friends when he was a boy. Margaret realized that she needed help to decipher the code. She knew nothing about cryptography, and time was of the essence. She remembered Mr. Blackwood, the archivist at the Library of Congress, with his eccentric personality and encyclopedic knowledge. He might be able to assist, or at least point her in the right direction. They returned to Eleanor's house, the coded message safely tucked away. Margaret immediately called the Library of Congress, her voice urgent. She explained the situation to Mr. Blackwood, emphasizing the importance of deciphering the code. Blackwood, initially reluctant, was intrigued by the discovery. He agreed to meet Margaret at the library the next day, bringing with him a colleague, a specialist in military codes and ciphers from World War I. The next day, Margaret, accompanied by Eleanor, met Blackwood and his colleague, a Dr. Emily Carter, in a secluded room at the library. Dr. Carter, a sharp, intelligent woman with a keen eye for detail, examined the coded message with a magnifying glass. "It's a variation of a Vigenère cipher," she announced after a few moments of careful study. "A polyalphabetic substitution cipher, quite common during the war. But it's been modified, made more complex. It will take some time to crack." Dr. Carter explained the principles of the Vigenère cipher, how it used a keyword to shift the letters of the alphabet, creating a seemingly unbreakable code. But she also explained that there were methods for cracking such ciphers, techniques involving frequency analysis and pattern recognition. "Do you have any idea what the keyword might be?" Dr. Carter asked Margaret. Margaret thought for a moment, reviewing everything she had learned about Victor. His letters, his poetry, his love for Eleanor, his father's stern pronouncements. And then it struck her. The inscription. "His sacrifice endures," she said, her voice filled with a sudden conviction. Could that be the keyword? Dr. Carter's eyes widened. "It's possible," she said. "It's a long shot, but it's worth a try." She set to work, meticulously applying the phrase "his sacrifice endures" to the coded message, shifting the letters according to the principles of the Vigenère cipher. It was a painstaking process, requiring patience and precision. Margaret and Eleanor watched in anxious silence, their hopes hanging on Dr. Carter's every move. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Carter looked up, a triumphant smile on her face. "I think I've got it," she announced. "The message is fragmented, but it's clear enough." She handed Margaret a sheet of paper, on which she had transcribed the deciphered message. It read, "Arlington. General. Betrayal.
Gold. Shipment.
Missing.
Thompson.
Witness. Silence." The words were jarring, explosive. They confirmed Margaret's suspicions that Victor had been investigating something far more significant than a simple act of disobedience. The message pointed to a conspiracy involving General Mason, a missing gold shipment, and Private Thompson as a witness. The final word, silence, spoke volumes about the forces that had been working to suppress the truth. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. It was becoming clear that Victor had stumbled upon something vast and dangerous, something that powerful and corrupt people were willing to protect using any measures. It was no longer a case of a simple soldier's disobedience. This pointed towards treason. Chapter 9. A Dance of Deception. The deciphered message, with its fragmented yet explosive revelations, sent a shockwave through Margaret and Eleanor. Arlington. General. Betrayal.
Gold.
Shipment. Missing.
Thompson. Witness.
Silence. The words painted a picture of a conspiracy reaching the highest echelons of power, a web of deceit and corruption that had ensnared Victor and ultimately led to his demise. The mention of gold was particularly intriguing. Was it a literal shipment of gold, or a metaphorical reference to something else of value? And what was Private Thompson's role in all of this? He was a witness, but to what? And why had he been silenced? Margaret realized that she needed to learn more about General Mason, about his activities during the war, about any potential connections to missing gold shipments. She decided to return to the Library of Congress, to delve deeper into the archives, focusing on military records and financial transactions from the war years. Eleanor, though frail, insisted on accompanying her. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to uncover the truth about her brother's fate, to clear his name, and to expose the conspiracy that had destroyed him. At the library, Margaret and Eleanor, with Mr. Blackwood's assistance, began to sift through mountains of documents, searching for any mention of General Mason and his involvement in financial matters. It was a daunting task, like searching for a needle in a haystack. But they persevered, driven by a shared sense of urgency and a burning desire for justice. They discovered that General Mason had been responsible for overseeing the logistics of supplying American troops in Europe, including the transfer of large sums of money and valuable resources. He had wielded considerable power and influence, and his decisions had been largely unquestioned. They also found records of several large shipments of gold bullion from the United States to France, intended to finance the war effort. These shipments had been shrouded in secrecy, their details classified, their movements closely guarded. And then they found it. A discrepancy. A missing shipment. A record of a large consignment of gold bullion that had been dispatched from New York in late October 1918, just weeks before the armistice, but had never reached its intended destination in France. The official explanation was that the ship carrying the gold had been sunk by a German U-boat. But there was no record of any such sinking in the naval archives. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a knowing glance. This was it. This was the missing gold shipment that Victor had been investigating. The betrayal mentioned in his coded message likely referred to the theft of this gold, a treasonous act orchestrated by someone within the military hierarchy. And General Mason, with his control over logistics and his access to classified information, was the prime suspect. But how could they prove it? They needed evidence, something concrete to link General Mason to the missing gold. They needed to find someone who knew the truth, someone who was willing to speak out. They decided to revisit Private Thompson's connection. He was a witness, according to Victor's message. But a witness to what? Had he seen something, overheard something, that implicated General Mason? Margaret remembered the small inscription on Thompson's headstone, "Saved by an angel. Forever grateful." And the carved V. This suggested a deep bond between Thompson and Victor, a level of trust that might have led Victor to confide in him. But if so, what silenced him? The weight of answering this question rested heavily on Margaret's shoulders. But she refused to stop. She couldn't stop. She had to keep moving. For Victor. For Eleanor. And now, for Private Thompson. The pieces were shifting, but slowly. They were beginning to build an undeniable, horrible truth. A truth that seemed to grow larger by the hour. Chapter 10. The Unsent Telegram. The missing gold shipment, the discrepancy in the records, and Private Thompson's role as a witness all pointed towards General Mason's involvement in a treasonous act. But Margaret and Eleanor still lacked concrete proof, something that would definitively link him to the conspiracy. They needed to find someone who could corroborate Victor's findings, someone who had first-hand knowledge of the events. They decided to focus on Private Thompson, hoping to uncover more information about his connection to Victor and his potential knowledge of the missing gold. They returned to Arlington National Cemetery, to Thompson's grave, searching for any further clues, any detail they might have overlooked. They examined the headstone again, carefully scrutinizing the inscription, the carved V, the surrounding area. They found nothing new. The cemetery remained silent, its secrets guarded by the rows of white headstones. As they were about to leave, Margaret noticed a small, weathered wooden box tucked beneath the overgrown shrub that partially hid Thompson's grave. It was old and battered, almost hidden from view. She carefully pulled it out, her heart pounding with anticipation. The box was locked, but the lock was old and rusty. Margaret easily forced it open, revealing a collection of personal items, a faded photograph of a young woman, a small, leather-bound diary, a few letters, and a folded piece of paper that appeared to be an unsent telegram. Margaret carefully unfolded the telegram, her hands trembling. It was addressed to Eleanor Mason, at her Georgetown address. The message was brief, urgent, and devastating. Eleanor, stop Victor in danger, stop investigating missing gold, stop General Mason involved, stop trust, no one, stop coming to Washington, stop meet me Arlington tomorrow dawn, stop Thompson. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a look of shock and horror. This was the confirmation they had been seeking, the concrete evidence linking General Mason to the conspiracy. Thompson had known the truth. He had been on his way to warn Eleanor, and he had been silenced before he could reach her. The telegram also explained why Victor had been so drawn to Arlington. It was the designated meeting place, the place where Thompson had hoped to rendezvous with Eleanor. But he had never made it. He had been murdered, his body buried in the very cemetery where he had hoped to find refuge. But who had killed him? And how had they known about his plans? The telegram suggested that Thompson suspected General Mason, but had he acted alone? Or were there others involved? The trust no one warning sent a chill down Margaret's spine. It suggested a deep-seated conspiracy, a network of individuals working to protect General Mason and conceal the truth. It also meant that Margaret and Eleanor were in danger. They had uncovered too much, they knew too much, and they were now targets. They decided to leave the cemetery immediately, taking the wooden box and its contents with them. They needed to find a safe place to examine the diary and the letters, to piece together the final details of the story. As they walked, Margaret noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted, its occupants watching them. She felt a surge of fear, a sense of being followed, of being hunted. She quickened her pace, urging Eleanor to do the same. They reached the street, hailed a taxi, and sped away, leaving the silent cemetery and its secrets behind. But they knew that they couldn't escape the shadows that were closing in around them. They were caught in a web of deceit and betrayal, and they had to find a way to break free, to expose the truth before it was too late. The sense of urgency was palpable. The taxi ride was silent, save for their ragged breaths. Both women felt a deep, unsettling chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Who was in that car? And what did they want? Chapter 11. The Weight of Remembrance. The unsent telegram, a chilling testament to Private Thompson's desperate attempt to warn Eleanor, confirmed their worst fears. General Mason was not only involved in the theft of the gold, but was also likely responsible for Thompson's murder. The trust no one warning echoed in Margaret's mind, amplifying the sense of danger that surrounded them. They returned to Eleanor's house, the wooden box containing Thompson's belongings clutched tightly in Margaret's hands. They locked the doors, drew the curtains, and settled in the parlor, the familiar scent of lavender and old books providing a small measure of comfort in the face of the growing threat. They carefully examined the contents of the box. The photograph was of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, likely Thompson's sweetheart or sister. The letters were mostly from her, filled with expressions of love and concern, with worries about his safety and longing for his return. They painted a picture of a young man caught up in the horrors of war, clinging to the hope of a peaceful future. The diary was the most revealing. Thompson wrote about his experiences in the trenches, the constant fear of death, the camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers, and his admiration for Lieutenant Victor Mason. He described Victor's bravery, his compassion, his unwavering sense of justice. He also wrote about the missing gold shipment, his growing suspicion that something was amiss, his belief that General Mason was involved. He detailed his observations, his conversations with Victor, his growing sense of unease. The final entry, dated just days before his death, was chilling. I have seen it. I know the truth. The general is a traitor. He stole the gold. Victor suspects, but he doesn't have proof. I do. I saw them loading the crates onto a different ship, a civilian vessel. I recognized one of the men, Major Harding, the general's aide. I must warn Victor. I must tell Eleanor. I fear for my life. Major Harding. A new name. A new player in the conspiracy. General Mason's aide, his trusted lieutenant, was likely his accomplice in the theft of the gold and the murder of Private Thompson. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a look of grim determination. They had the proof they needed. They had the names, the dates, the details. But they also knew that they were in grave danger. They had to expose the truth, but they had to do it carefully, strategically. They couldn't go to the authorities, not yet. General Mason still had influence, connections, and the warning trust. No one suggested that the conspiracy might extend into the very institutions that were supposed to uphold justice. They decided to seek help from an unexpected source, Senator James Worthington, a powerful and influential politician known for his integrity and his commitment to fighting corruption. He was also a close friend of Eleanor's late husband, a man who had shared her passion for justice. Eleanor contacted Senator Worthington, arranging a private meeting at his office. She explained the situation, the evidence they had uncovered, the danger they were in. Worthington listened intently, his expression grave. He promised to help them, to use his influence to expose the truth and bring the perpetrators to justice. He also warned them to be careful, to stay hidden, to trust no one but him. He arranged for them to be moved to a safe house, a secluded location outside the city, where they would be protected until he could gather enough evidence to make his move. As they left Eleanor's house, under the cover of darkness, Margaret felt a profound sense of sadness, a weight of remembrance for the lives that had been lost, the sacrifices that had been made, the truth that had been buried for so long. But she also felt a flicker of hope, a belief that justice would prevail, that Victor's sacrifice would finally be acknowledged, that his name would be cleared. The safe house was quiet, cold, and impersonal, but it was safe.
For now.
The waiting began, punctuated by the terrifying question, would it be enough? Chapter 12. Across the Potomac. The safe house, a nondescript farmhouse nestled in the Virginia countryside, offered a temporary respite from the danger that lurked in Washington. The rolling hills, the quiet solitude, the vast expanse of sky provided a stark contrast to the claustrophobic fear that had gripped Margaret and Eleanor in the city. But the peace was fragile, a thin veneer over the underlying tension that gnawed at them. Senator Worthington had promised to act swiftly, to gather evidence, to build a case against General Mason and Major Harding. But he had also warned them that it would take time, that he needed to proceed cautiously, strategically. The wheels of justice, he had explained, turned slowly, especially when powerful individuals were involved. Days turned into weeks, and the waiting became unbearable. Margaret and Eleanor spent their time poring over the documents they had collected, reviewing the evidence, searching for any detail they might have missed. They relived the memories of Victor, of his letters, of his poetry, of his unwavering spirit. They clung to the hope that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that his name would be cleared, that justice would prevail. The isolation of the safe house, while necessary for their protection, began to take its toll. They were cut off from the outside world, their only contact with Senator Worthington through infrequent, coded telephone calls. The silence, broken only by the sounds of nature, amplified their anxiety, their fear, their uncertainty. Margaret found herself drawn to the nearby Potomac River, its wide, flowing waters a symbol of both freedom and separation. She would often walk along the banks, gazing across the river towards Washington, towards the city where the truth lay hidden, where the perpetrators of the conspiracy continued to live their lives unpunished. One afternoon, as she was walking along the river, she noticed a small, secluded cove, hidden from view by a cluster of willow trees. She felt a strange pull towards this place, an inexplicable sense of familiarity. She stepped into the cove, her feet sinking slightly into the soft, muddy ground. And then she saw it. A small, wooden marker, almost completely hidden by the overgrown vegetation. It was old and weathered, the inscription barely legible. She knelt down, brushing away the leaves and dirt, and deciphered the words. Here lies a friend. Lost, but not forgotten. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The words resonated with the inscription on the monument, with the sentiment of Victor's sacrifice. Could this be another hidden message, another clue left by Victor? She examined the marker more closely, searching for any further details. And then, she found it. A small, almost imperceptible carving, just below the inscription. It was a symbol, a stylized representation of a bird in flight. She recognized the symbol. It was the same symbol that had appeared on the cover of Victor's book of poetry, the one Eleanor had shown her. It was his personal mark, his signature. This confirmed her suspicion. Victor had been here. He had left this marker, this hidden message.
But why?
What was the significance of this place? She looked around, her eyes scanning the cove, the surrounding trees, the riverbank. And then she noticed something else. A faint, almost imperceptible trail leading away from the cove, disappearing into the woods. She followed the trail, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was overgrown and difficult to follow, but she persevered, driven by a sense of urgency, a feeling that she was close to uncovering another piece of the puzzle. The trail led her to a small, abandoned cabin, hidden deep within the woods. The cabin was dilapidated, its windows boarded up, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. It looked as though it hadn't been used in years. A sense of unease settled upon her. This felt wrong, dangerous. But there was no turning back now. Victor had led her here for a reason. Chapter 13. The Spy's Confession. The abandoned cabin, shrouded in shadows and silence, exuded an aura of mystery and danger. Margaret hesitated at the threshold, her hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. The feeling of unease she had experienced on the trail intensified, a primal instinct warning her to turn back. But the knowledge that Victor had led her here, that this place held another piece of the puzzle, compelled her to proceed. She pushed open the creaking door, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. Cobwebs hung like macabre tapestries from the rafters. The only light filtered through cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a rickety table, a broken chair, a rusted bed frame. It looked as though it had been abandoned in a hurry, its occupant leaving behind a life disrupted, a story unfinished. Margaret searched the cabin, her eyes scanning every corner, every crevice. She found nothing of significance, nothing that immediately revealed the cabin's purpose or its connection to Victor. As she was about to give up, she noticed a loose floorboard beneath the bed frame. She knelt down, prying it open with her penknife. A small, hidden compartment was revealed, containing a single, leather-bound journal. She carefully lifted the journal, her hands trembling. The cover was blank, unmarked. She opened it, revealing pages filled with elegant, flowing handwriting. It was another diary, but this one didn't belong to Victor or Thompson. The script was different, more refined, more deliberate. She began to read, and as she did, a chilling realization dawned upon her. This was the diary of Major Harding, General Mason's aide, the man implicated in the theft of the gold and the murder of Private Thompson. The diary entries detailed Harding's involvement in the conspiracy, his role in diverting the gold shipment, his growing unease about General Mason's ruthless methods. He wrote about his fear of exposure, his guilt over Thompson's death, his desire to escape the web of deceit that he had helped to create. The final entry, dated just weeks before the armistice, was a confession, a desperate attempt to atone for his sins. I can no longer live with this guilt. I have betrayed my country, my conscience, my soul. The general is a monster, a ruthless tyrant who will stop at nothing to achieve his goals. He stole the gold, he murdered Thompson, and he will silence anyone who threatens to expose him. I fear for my life, but I must do what is right. I have decided to confess, to reveal the truth to the authorities. I have hidden this diary as a testament, a record of my crimes and my repentance. May God forgive me. Margaret closed the diary, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the irrefutable proof of General Mason's guilt and Major Harding's complicity. Harding's confession, his desperate attempt to atone for his sins, provided the evidence they needed to bring the perpetrators to justice. But where was Harding? Had he succeeded in confessing to the authorities? Or had General Mason silenced him, as he had silenced Thompson? The diary didn't say. Margaret realized that she needed to get this diary to Senator Worthington immediately. It was the key to exposing the conspiracy, to clearing Victor's name, to bringing justice to the fallen. As she left the cabin, she heard a twig snap behind her. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man in a military uniform. It was General Mason. He was holding a gun. He had found them. But how? Chapter 14. A stolen photograph. General Mason's sudden appearance, his imposing figure silhouetted against the fading light, sent a wave of terror through Margaret. The gun in his hand, glinting menacingly, was a stark reminder of the danger they were in. He had found them, despite all their precautions, and he was clearly prepared to silence them permanently. "You shouldn't have meddled, Miss O'Connor," Mason said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You should have left well enough alone." Margaret stood her ground, her body trembling, but her gaze fixed on the general's. She clutched Harding's diary tightly, her only weapon against his power and his ruthlessness. "I know the truth, General," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I know about the stolen gold, about Private Thompson's murder, about Major Harding's confession." Mason's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Harding's confession?" he said, his voice a low growl. "You have no proof." "I have his diary," Margaret replied, holding up the leather-bound book. "It's all in here. His detailed account of your crimes, your betrayal, your treachery." Mason took a step closer, his gun trained on Margaret. "Give it to me," he demanded. Margaret hesitated, her mind racing. She knew that if she surrendered the diary, she would lose her only leverage, her only chance of exposing the truth. But she also knew that he wouldn't hesitate to shoot her. Suddenly, Eleanor emerged from the shadows, her frail figure surprisingly resolute. "Don't give it to him, Margaret," she said, her voice firm. "He killed my brother, he killed Private Thompson, and he won't hesitate to kill us. He's a monster, a traitor to his country." Mason turned his attention to Eleanor, his eyes filled with rage. "You old fool," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You should have stayed out of this. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me greatly," Eleanor retorted. "You destroyed my family, you stole my brother's life, and you will pay for your crimes." As Mason was distracted by Eleanor, Margaret saw her opportunity. She lunged forward, shoving the diary into her satchel and grabbing a fallen branch from the ground. She swung the branch with all her might, striking Mason's arm. The gun went off, the bullet whizzing past Margaret's head, lodging itself in a nearby tree. Mason staggered back, momentarily stunned, dropping the gun. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed Eleanor's hand and pulled her away, running towards the woods, towards the river, towards any possible escape. Mason recovered quickly, picking up the gun and pursuing them. They could hear him crashing through the undergrowth, his shouts echoing through the trees. They reached the riverbank, their lungs burning, their legs aching. They had to cross the river to get back to Washington, to reach Senator Worthington. But the river was wide and swift, the current strong. They had no boat, no way to cross safely. As they stood there, hesitating, Margaret noticed something on the ground, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. It was a photograph, a faded, water-damaged photograph. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. It was a picture of Victor, standing beside Major Harding. They were both smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders. They looked like friends, comrades, not conspirators. On the back, in Victor's handwriting, was a single word: brotherhood. This photograph changed everything. It suggested a different dynamic between Victor and Harding, a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. It cast doubt on Harding's role as a willing accomplice, suggesting that he might have been coerced, manipulated, or even framed by General Mason. It also explained why Victor had left the marker in the cove, why he had led Margaret to Harding's diary. He had trusted Harding, he had believed in his innocence, and he had wanted the truth to be revealed. The sound of Mason's approaching footsteps brought Margaret back to the present. They were out of time. They had to make a decision. And now, with the discovery of this photo, Margaret understood one final, vital piece of the puzzle. Mason hadn't simply silenced those who knew too much. He had replaced them. Chapter 15. The General's Daughter. The photograph, depicting Victor and Major Harding in a display of camaraderie, shattered Margaret's previous assumptions. Harding, far from being a willing accomplice, might have been another victim of General Mason's machinations. The word brotherhood scrawled on the back suggested a bond that transcended military rank, a connection that Mason had likely exploited to frame Harding and cover his own tracks. The sound of Mason's pursuit, his heavy breathing, and the snapping of twigs under his boots spurred Margaret and Eleanor to action. They couldn't cross the river, it was too dangerous. They had to find another way to escape, another way to reach Senator Worthington. Margaret remembered the coded telephone calls from Worthington, the secure line he had established for their communication. There was a small general store a few miles down the road, the only place within walking distance that had a telephone. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. They ran, pushing their aging bodies to their limits, their lungs burning, their legs aching. Mason was gaining on them, his shouts echoing through the woods. They reached the road, a narrow, winding stretch of asphalt that offered little cover. They could see the general store in the distance, its lights a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. As they ran, a car suddenly appeared, speeding towards them. It was the dark sedan, the one Margaret had seen at Arlington Cemetery. The one that had been following them. Margaret's heart sank. They were trapped. Mason had anticipated their every move. He had used them to find Harding's diary, and now he was closing in for the kill. But then something unexpected happened. The car screeched to a halt, blocking their path. The driver's side door opened, and a figure emerged. It wasn't Mason. It was a woman, a young woman with striking red hair and piercing blue eyes, the same eyes as Victor and Eleanor. "Get in," she said, her voice urgent.
Quickly.
Margaret and Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to trust this stranger. But they had no choice. Mason was closing in, and this woman, whoever she was, offered their only chance of escape. They scrambled into the car, and the woman sped away, leaving Mason shouting and cursing in the distance. As they drove, Margaret studied the woman, her mind racing. The resemblance to Victor and Eleanor was undeniable. She had to be a relative, a member of the Mason family. But who was she? And why was she helping them?
Who are you?
Margaret asked, her voice trembling. My name is Amelia, the woman replied. I'm General Mason's daughter. Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a look of shock and disbelief. General Mason's daughter? Helping them? It seemed impossible. I know about my father's crimes, Amelia continued. I know about the stolen gold, about Private Thompson, about Major Harding. I've been trying to expose him for years, but he's too powerful, too well-connected. She explained that she had been secretly investigating her father, gathering evidence, building a case against him. She had learned about Victor's investigation, about his friendship with Harding, about the coded message hidden on the monument. She had been following Margaret and Eleanor, hoping to connect with them, to join forces. My father is a monster, Amelia said, her voice filled with anger and disgust. He cares about nothing but power and money. He destroyed my brother, he destroyed countless lives, and he must be stopped. She revealed that she had been the one who had carved the inscription on the monument, the tribute to Victor's sacrifice. She had also left the small, carved V on Thompson's headstone, a symbol of her brother's courage and her own determination to expose the truth. And the Brotherhood photograph? She had taken it years earlier and placed a copy where she knew it might, eventually, be discovered. Amelia's story, her courageous defiance of her own father, gave Margaret and Eleanor renewed hope. They were no longer alone. They had a powerful ally, someone who knew the inner workings of Mason's world, someone who could help them bring him to justice. Amelia drove them to a hidden location, a safe house she had prepared, far from the reach of her father. She had contacted Senator Worthington, informing him of the new developments, of Harding's diary, of her own evidence against her father. The final confrontation was drawing near. The truth was about to be revealed. And the weight of all those silences was ready to break, crushing those who would bury it for their own gain. The alliance, though unexpected, felt right. It felt destined. It felt like the final missing piece. Chapter 16. Whispers in the Ward. Amelia's safe house, a small, unassuming apartment in a quiet neighborhood of Alexandria, provided a much-needed sanctuary. The three women, united by their shared quest for justice, huddled together, reviewing the evidence, strategizing their next move. Harding's diary, the photograph, Amelia's own accumulated evidence, and Senator Worthington's political influence formed a formidable arsenal against General Mason. Worthington had informed them that he was preparing to present the evidence to a special committee of Congress, a closed-door session where he could lay out the case without fear of interference from Mason's allies. He was confident that he could secure an indictment, but he warned them that it would be a difficult battle. Mason was a powerful and influential figure, with friends in high places. While they waited for Worthington's summons, Margaret felt a nagging unease, a sense that something was still missing. Harding's diary, while damning, was written from the perspective of a man consumed by guilt and fear. It lacked concrete details about the actual mechanics of the gold theft, about the specific individuals involved, about the final destination of the missing shipment. She remembered the trust no one warning in Thompson's unsent telegram. It suggested a wider conspiracy, a network of individuals working to protect Mason and conceal the truth. She wondered if there were others involved, others who had benefited from the stolen gold, others who had a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. An idea struck her, a long shot, but one worth pursuing. Major Harding, if he was still alive, might be the key. He was the only one who could provide the missing details, the concrete evidence that would definitively link Mason to the crime and expose the full extent of the conspiracy. But where was he? Had Mason silenced him, as he had silenced Thompson? Or had he managed to escape, to go into hiding? Margaret decided to explore the possibility that Harding might still be alive. She remembered Mr. Blackwood, the archivist at the Library of Congress, with his vast knowledge of military records and his somewhat eccentric personality. He might be able to help. She contacted Blackwood, explaining her theory, her belief that Harding might still be alive. Blackwood, initially skeptical, was intrigued by the photograph of Victor and Harding, by the word brotherhood scrawled on the back. He agreed to help, to search through his archives, to see if he could find any trace of Harding after the war. Days later, Blackwood called Margaret with a startling discovery. He had found a record of a Major Harold Harding, a man matching Harding's description, who had been admitted to a veterans hospital in upstate New York in 1919, suffering from severe shell shock and amnesia. He had been discharged a year later, his conditions seemingly improved, but his whereabouts were unknown. Margaret's heart leaped. This was it. This was the lead she had been hoping for. Harding was alive, or at least he had been alive a year ago. He might still be out there, living under an assumed identity, his memory fragmented, his past shrouded in secrecy. She shared the information with Amelia and Eleanor. They agreed that they had to find him. He was the key witness, the missing link in the chain of evidence. They decided to travel to the Veterans Hospital in New York to see if they could find any trace of Harding, any clue to his current whereabouts. The hospital was a sprawling, imposing structure, surrounded by vast, manicured lawns. It was a place of healing, but also a place of profound sadness, a repository of broken bodies and shattered minds. They spoke to the hospital administrator, a kindly, elderly woman who listened patiently to their story. She checked the records, confirming that a Major Harold Harding had indeed been a patient there, but she could offer no information about his current whereabouts. He had been discharged, and they had lost contact with him. Margaret was disheartened, but she refused to give up. She asked to see Harding's medical records, hoping to find some clue, some detail that might shed light on his past, his personality, his potential connections. The administrator hesitated, citing patient confidentiality, but Margaret persisted, explaining the importance of their quest, the need to expose a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power. Finally, the administrator relented, granting them access to Harding's records. They were voluminous, detailing his physical and mental condition, his treatments, his progress. As they read through the records, Margaret noticed something peculiar. Harding had frequently mentioned a recurring dream, a vivid, terrifying nightmare that haunted him relentlessly. He described a dark, enclosed space, the smell of salt water, the sound of waves crashing, and a feeling of intense fear and claustrophobia. The description resonated with Margaret. It sounded like a ship at sea. Could this be a memory, a fragmented recollection of the gold theft, of the moment when the shipment was diverted to a different vessel? She also noticed that Harding had a visitor, a woman who came to see him regularly during his stay at the hospital. Her name was listed as Sarah Miller. Could this be a clue to his current whereabouts? Could this be the person who might, even now, hold the answer? Chapter 17. The Price of Valor. The recurring dream, the dark, enclosed space, the smell of salt water, and the woman named Sarah Miller. These fragments from Major Harding's medical records offered a tantalizing glimpse into his shattered memory and a potential link to his current whereabouts. Margaret felt a surge of hope, a belief that they were close to finding him, to unlocking the final secrets of the conspiracy. They decided to focus on Sarah Miller, hoping that she could lead them to Harding. They searched the hospital records for any information about her, any address, any contact details. But they found nothing. She was listed simply as a visitor, with no further information provided. They questioned the hospital staff, the nurses, the doctors who had treated Harding, but no one remembered Sarah Miller. She was a ghost, a phantom visitor who had left no trace. Margaret was frustrated, but she refused to give up. She decided to explore the local area, to visit the nearby towns and villages, to see if she could find any trace of Sarah Miller or Major Harding. Amelia, with her knowledge of the region and her contacts within the community, proved to be an invaluable asset. She used her connections to inquire about Sarah Miller, to spread the word that they were looking for her. Days turned into weeks, and their search yielded nothing. They visited countless homes, businesses, churches, and community centers, but no one recognized the name Sarah Miller or had any information about Major Harding. Margaret began to despair, to fear that they had reached a dead end. Harding might be lost forever, his memory fragmented, his identity obscured, his testimony beyond their reach. Then, one evening, as they were returning to their temporary lodgings, a small, unassuming boarding house in a nearby village, Amelia received a phone call. It was from a local shopkeeper, a woman who had heard about their search. I think I might know the woman you're looking for," the shopkeeper said, her voice hesitant. "There's a Sarah Miller who lives on the outskirts of town, in an old farmhouse. She keeps to herself, mostly. But I remember her mentioning something about visiting a soldier in the hospital, years ago." Margaret and Eleanor exchanged a look of excitement and anticipation. This could be it. This could be the break they had been waiting for. They immediately drove to the farmhouse, a dilapidated structure surrounded by overgrown fields. It looked abandoned, deserted, its windows dark and empty. They hesitated, unsure whether to approach. The house exuded an aura of loneliness and despair, a sense of a life lived in isolation, a past shrouded in secrecy. Summoning their courage, they knocked on the door. There was no answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Finally, they heard the slow, deliberate shuffle of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with tired eyes and a weary expression. She was frail, her skin pale and translucent, but her gaze was sharp and intelligent. "Sarah Miller?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. The woman nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy. Margaret explained who they were, their connection to Victor Mason, their quest to uncover the truth about the missing gold shipment, their belief that Major Harding might hold the key. Sarah Miller listened patiently, her expression unreadable. When Margaret finished, she remained silent for a long moment, studying them with those piercing eyes. "Come in," she finally said, stepping aside to allow them to enter. The interior of the farmhouse was dim and cluttered, filled with antique furniture, faded photographs, and the lingering scent of lavender and old books. It felt eerily similar to Eleanor's house in Georgetown, a world untouched by the modern era, a repository of memories and secrets. "Harold is here," Sarah said, her voice soft.
He's not well.
The war, it changed him. He doesn't remember much. But he sometimes talks about the gold, about the general, about a man named Victor. A chill ran down Margaret's spine. It wasn't just that Harding was here. It was that Sarah knew. She knew everything. Chapter 18. The Unveiling. Sarah Miller's words, "Harold is here," sent a wave of both relief and trepidation through Margaret. Relief that they had finally found Major Harding, the key witness to General Mason's treachery, and trepidation about his mental state, his ability to recall the events of the past, his willingness to testify. Sarah led them to a small, dimly lit bedroom at the back of the farmhouse. The air was heavy with the scent of sickness and old age. A man lay in the bed, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was frail, his skin pale and translucent, his hair white and wispy. This was Major Harold Harding, the man who had witnessed the theft of the gold, the man who had been haunted by his guilt and his fear. Margaret approached the bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She gently touched Harding's hand, his skin cold and clammy. "Major Harding?"
she said softly. "Can you hear me?"
Harding's eyes fluttered open, revealing a vacant, unfocused gaze. He looked at Margaret, but she could see no recognition in his eyes. "Harold," Sarah said, her voice gentle and soothing. "These ladies are friends. They're here to help you." Harding's gaze shifted to Sarah, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Sarah?" he whispered, his voice weak and raspy. "Yes, Harold," Sarah replied. "I'm here." Margaret explained who they were, their connection to Victor Mason, their quest to expose General Mason's crimes. She spoke slowly, clearly, using simple words, hoping to penetrate the fog of his amnesia. Harding listened, his expression blank, his eyes unfocused. He seemed to struggle to understand, to grasp the meaning of her words. Then, suddenly, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Victor," he whispered. "My friend Victor." Margaret seized on this moment of clarity. She showed him the photograph, the one of him and Victor, their arms around each other's shoulders, the word brotherhood scrawled on the back. Harding's eyes widened, his breathing becoming more rapid. He reached out, his trembling hand touching the photograph. "Victor," he said again, his voice stronger this time. He knew. He knew about the gold, about the general. His voice trailed off, his eyes clouding over again. He seemed to slip back into the fog of his amnesia, his memory fragmented, his past shrouded in darkness. Margaret persisted, gently questioning him, prompting him with details from his diary, from Thompson's unsent telegram, from Victor's letters. Slowly, painstakingly, fragments of memory began to surface. He spoke of the gold shipment, of the secret meeting with General Mason, of the orders to divert the gold to a different vessel, of his growing suspicion and fear. He remembered Private Thompson, his witnessing of the transfer of the gold, his desperate attempt to warn Victor and Eleanor. He remembered his own attempt to confess, to reveal the truth, and his subsequent capture and silencing by General Mason's men. He spoke of his escape, his flight, his years of living in hiding, his mind shattered by the trauma of the war and the guilt of his complicity. His testimony, though fragmented, was damning. It confirmed everything that Margaret and Eleanor had suspected, everything that Victor had uncovered. It provided the concrete details, the irrefutable proof of General Mason's treachery. As Harding spoke, Sarah revealed her own story. She had been a nurse at the Veterans Hospital, where she had met Harding. She had fallen in love with him, Despite his broken mind and his shattered past, she had helped him escape. She had given him a new identity. She had cared for him all these years, protecting him from the world and from his own demons. With Harding's testimony secured and Sarah's story adding another layer of poignant truth, Margaret contacted Senator Worthington. It was time. Time to unveil it all. Time to trigger the downfall that had been so long in coming. Chapter 19. Beyond the Battlefield. With Major Harding's fragmented but damning testimony, Senator Worthington moved swiftly. He presented the evidence: Harding's diary, the photograph, Thompson's unsent telegram, Amelia's accumulated information, and now Harding's own recollections to the Special Committee of Congress. The closed-door session was tense, the atmosphere charged with anticipation and disbelief. Worthington laid out the case meticulously, weaving together the threads of evidence, exposing the web of deceit and corruption that General Mason had spun. He detailed the theft of the gold, the murder of Private Thompson, the silencing of Major Harding, the betrayal of Victor Mason, and the long years of cover-up and denial. The committee members, initially skeptical, were gradually swayed by the overwhelming weight of the evidence. The photograph of Victor and Harding, the word brotherhood scrawled on the back, was particularly compelling, shattering the image of Harding as a willing accomplice and revealing the depth of Mason's manipulation. Harding, brought to Washington under heavy guard and with Sarah by his side, testified before the committee. His testimony, though still fragmented, was powerful and moving. He spoke of his friendship with Victor, his admiration for his courage and integrity, his own guilt and remorse, his years of living in hiding, his desperate desire for redemption. Amelia, too, testified, her voice filled with anger and pain. She spoke of her father's ruthless ambition, his disregard for human life, his betrayal of his country and his family. She presented her own evidence, the documents she had gathered, the witnesses she had contacted, the secrets she had uncovered. General Mason, summoned to appear before the committee, denied all the accusations. He maintained his innocence, claiming that he was the victim of a conspiracy, a smear campaign orchestrated by his enemies. He dismissed Harding's testimony as the ramblings of a madman, Amelia's accusations as the vengeful acts of a disaffected daughter. But his denials rang hollow. The evidence was too strong, the testimony too compelling. The committee members, swayed by the weight of the truth, voted unanimously to recommend an indictment. General Mason was arrested, charged with treason, theft, murder, and obstruction of justice. The news sent shockwaves through Washington, shattering the image of the decorated war hero, exposing the dark underbelly of power and corruption. The trial was a media sensation, the public captivated by the drama of a fallen hero, a family torn apart, a conspiracy unveiled. Margaret, Eleanor, Amelia, and Sarah attended the trial every day, sitting together in the courtroom, their presence a silent testament to the power of truth and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Harding, his memory gradually returning, his confidence growing, testified with clarity and conviction. He recounted the events of the past, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. He described the theft of the gold, the murder of Thompson, his own forced silence, and his years of living in fear. General Mason, his defense crumbling under the weight of the evidence, his lies exposed, his reputation shattered, finally broke down. He confessed to his crimes, his voice a hollow whisper, his eyes filled with despair. He was found guilty on all counts, stripped of his rank and honors, and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict was a victory for justice, a vindication for Victor Mason, a testament to the courage of those who had dared to speak truth to power. For Margaret, it was the culmination of a long and arduous journey, a quest that had begun with a cryptic inscription on a monument and had led her to uncover a conspiracy that had reached the highest levels of power. She had found the truth, she had brought the perpetrators to justice, and she had honored the sacrifice of a forgotten hero. For Eleanor, it was a moment of profound sadness and bittersweet relief. She had finally learned the truth about her brother's fate. She had cleared his name, and she had avenged his death. But the pain of his loss, The years of uncertainty and grief would never fully heal. It was over, but the scars, both visible and invisible, remained. The victory felt like a hollow one, but it was a victory. The battlefield had expanded far beyond the trenches of France, but the cost was, ultimately, just as devastating. Chapter 20. A love etched in time. The trial was over. General Mason was imprisoned, his legacy shattered, his crimes exposed. Justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. But the emotional scars of the long battle remained, etched deep within the hearts of those who had fought for truth and remembrance. Margaret, Eleanor, Amelia, and Sarah gathered at Eleanor's Georgetown home, the place where their journey had begun. The house, filled with the memories of Victor, felt both comforting and melancholic. The victory was bittersweet, a triumph tinged with the enduring pain of loss. They sat in the parlor, the familiar scent of lavender and old books filling the air. The photographs of Victor, his smiling face, his piercing blue eyes, seemed to watch over them, a silent reminder of the sacrifice he had made. Eleanor, her frail body weakened by age and grief, but her spirit unbroken, spoke first. "We did it," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "We brought him to justice. We cleared Victor's name. He can finally rest in peace." Amelia, her eyes filled with tears, nodded. "He was a monster, my father. He destroyed so many lives. But he didn't win. We won. Victor won." Sarah, her hand resting on Harding's arm, spoke softly. "Harold is getting better. His memory is returning. He's finally free from the shadows, from the guilt, from the fear." Harding, his gaze still somewhat distant, but his voice stronger, looked at Margaret. "Thank you," he said. "You gave me back my life. You gave me back my honor." Margaret, her own emotions a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a profound sense of sadness, smiled. "We did it together," she said. "We couldn't have done it without each other." They spent the afternoon sharing memories of Victor, of his letters, his poetry, his unwavering spirit. They spoke of his love for Eleanor, his friendship with Harding, his courage in the face of adversity. They remembered his dreams for the future, his hopes for a life beyond the battlefield, a life that had been stolen from him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Margaret felt a sense of closure, a feeling that their journey had reached its end. They had uncovered the truth, they had brought the perpetrators to justice, and they had honored the sacrifice of a forgotten hero. But there was one final act of remembrance that Margaret felt compelled to perform. She returned to the tidal basin, to the monument, to the place where it had all begun. She stood before the pillar, the cryptic inscription, "His sacrifice endures," etched in stone. She traced the words with her finger, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She looked around, at the cherry blossoms, now fading, their delicate petals scattered on the ground. The city was quiet, the air still and peaceful. The war was over, the battles fought, the scars healing. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, silver locket. It contained a miniature portrait of Victor, a copy of the one Eleanor had given her. She had also placed a single, dried cherry blossom inside, a reminder of the day she found the hidden message. She carefully placed the locket at the base of the pillar, nestled among the fallen petals, a final tribute to Victor's memory, a symbol of a love etched in time, a sacrifice that would endure forever. As she walked away, she made one final addition. With her penknife, she carefully added, in the same style of the original inscription, and remembered. The sun set, bathing the entire scene in a melancholic, golden light. It was finally over. Epilogue. Years passed. The wounds of war, both physical and emotional, slowly began to heal, but the scars remained, a permanent reminder of the sacrifices made, the lives lost, the battles fought. Margaret continued to visit the tidal basin, to the monument, to the place where she had first discovered the cryptic inscription, the starting point of her long and arduous journey. She would stand before the pillar, tracing the words, "His sacrifice endures," and the addition she had made, and remembered, her heart filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. She often thought of Victor, of his courage, his compassion, his unwavering spirit. She remembered his letters, his poetry, his dreams for a future that had been stolen from him. She kept his memory alive, sharing his story with others, ensuring that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. Eleanor, her frail body finally succumbing to the weight of years, passed away peacefully in her sleep, her heart finally at rest, reunited with her beloved brother. Margaret inherited the Georgetown house, filling it with her own memories, her own life, but always preserving the spirit of Victor, the echoes of his presence. Amelia, estranged from her father, built a new life for herself, dedicating her time to helping veterans, to fighting for justice, to ensuring that the horrors of war would never be repeated. She remained close to Margaret, their bond forged in the crucible of their shared struggle, their friendship a testament to the enduring power of human connection. Harding, his memory gradually returning, his health improving, found solace and purpose in working with other veterans, helping them to overcome their trauma, to rebuild their lives. He and Sarah remained together, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness of their past. The stolen gold was never recovered, its whereabouts remaining a mystery. But its value, its significance, paled in comparison to the human lives that had been affected, the sacrifices that had been made, the truth that had been revealed. Margaret, reflecting on her journey, on the unexpected turns it had taken, on the people she had met, on the secrets she had uncovered, realized that the inscription on the monument, "His sacrifice endures," held a deeper meaning than she had initially understood. It wasn't just about Victor's sacrifice, it was about the sacrifices of all those who had been touched by the war, all those who had fought for truth, for justice, for remembrance. It was about the enduring power of love, of friendship, of courage, of the human spirit. It was about the importance of remembering, of honoring the past, of learning from the mistakes of history, of striving for a better future. And as she stood there, beneath the cherry blossoms, the gentle breeze whispering through the leaves, she knew that Vic,